Welcome to the Pharma Files, where medicine meets mystery. I'm Lance Simard.
And I'm Justine Burke.
So I want you to picture a tuberculosis ward. We are in the year 1925.
Right.
And there's this dying soldier, and he is hiding a secret stash of raw milk. He's literally drinking quarts of it every single day.
Just hoarding it under his bed, basically.
Exactly. He is breaking every strict hospital rule they have because he genuinely, truly believes this milk is a miracle cure.
Yeah. Right.
But the thing is, what he doesn't know, and honestly what he couldn't possibly know at the time, is that the very liquid he thinks is saving his life is, it's likely teeming with the exact same disease that's actively killing him.
Which is just incredibly dark.
Right. So today, we're plunging into the bizarre, totally deadly, and honestly surprisingly modern history of the milk cure.
Yeah, and the mission of our conversation today is really to untangle a full century of medical history, because we aren't just looking back to, gawk at some forgotten pre-antibiotic medical fad.
Right, it's bigger than that.
Much bigger. We are tracking the exact anatomy of a medical belief. We're going to examine how a really desperate treatment, one born out of absolute biological necessity, transformed decades later into a modern, sophisticated conspiracy theory.
Let's get right into it, because the journey we've mapped out for you today, it hits on so many unexpected cultural touchstones. I mean, we are dealing with rural vampire folklore.
Oh yeah, the vampires.
We've got the tragic glamour of 19th century poets, the really gritty microbiology of the human lung, and ultimately, the deep and sometimes dangerous psychology of human belief.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
It is. And to really understand why a dying soldier would place all his chips on unpasteurized milk, we have to immerse ourselves in the sheer, unadulterated terror of the world he lived in, a world ruled by a disease they just called consumption.
Yeah, and the numbers regarding consumption, what we obviously now identify as tuberculosis or TB, they are almost unfathomable for a modern mind to even process. Like, if we look at the demographic data from 1815, this single disease was responsible for 1 out of every 4 deaths in England.
1 in 4. I want to frame that for you without the historical distance.
Yeah.
If you look at your family, your friends, your coworkers, imagine a respiratory pathogen just taking 25% of them.
Yeah.
And doing it consistently, year after year, with absolute zero discrimination.
The impact across the whole European continent throughout the 1800s was nearly identical. It accounted for roughly a quarter of all mortality.
Wow.
And the terror was really compounded by this total ignorance. Because Robert Koch, he wouldn't identify the bacterial cause, which is Mycobacterium tuberculosis, until 1882.
So for decades, they just had no clue.
Right. For the vast majority of the 19th century, humanity was basically being hunted by an invisible predator. The medical establishment was flying completely blind. They had no framework for germ theory, no understanding of microscopic transmission, and honestly, no idea how to stop it.
Let's dig into the actual microbiology of it for a second.
Right.
Because the way this bacteria operates inside the body explains so much of the horror it caused.
It really does.
When someone inhaled the bacteria, it wasn't a fast, dramatic illness like cholera, right? It was insidious.
It is an incredibly highly evolved pathogen. So when Mycobacterium tuberculosis enters the lungs, the body's immune system sends macrophages. These are these large white blood cells to essentially swallow the invader.
Right. That's just the standard immune response.
Exactly. But this specific bacteria has a really unique defense mechanism. It possesses an exceptionally thick, waxy cell wall that's rich in mycolic acids.
Okay.
And because of this armor, the macrophage swallows the bacteria, but it just can't digest it. The bacteria actually survives and then replicates inside the very immune cell that was sent to destroy it.
That is wild. It's like a bank robber who realizes he can't escape the police, so he just bricks himself inside the bank vault.
That is a perfect analogy, yeah.
So the body responds to this unbreakable invader by building these rigid calcium walls, which are called granulomas, right around the infected cells. Yeah. It basically cordons off the area to stop the spread.
Right.
But that means the bacteria is just lying completely dormant inside the lung tissue, just waiting for the immune system to blink.
That is a highly accurate mechanical way to look at it. And when the immune system does eventually falter, maybe due to stress or malnutrition or age, the bacteria breaks out.
And that's when it gets really bad.
Yeah. The center of these granulomas undergoes a process called caseous necrosis. And caseous literally means cheese-like.
Oh, gross.
I know. The lung tissue literally decays into a soft, white, necrotic mass. And the patient then coughs up this highly infectious, decaying tissue, which spreads the bacteria to anyone sharing the room.
while simultaneously just destroying their own respiratory capacity.
Exactly.
And because it moves so slowly, literally eating the lungs millimeter by millimeter, the visible physical toll was just devastating. People literally wasted away to skeletons.
He did.
And, when human beings don't have scientific answers for a relentless, highly visible horror spreading through their own homes, we create mythology.
We always do.
The source material highlights this incredibly macabre reality that played out in rural New England. We basically see the birth of the American vampire myth.
The sociological response in places like Rhode Island and Vermont was profound. You would have a farming household where one family member begins to waste away, cough up blood, grow pale, and eventually die.
Right.
And then months or even years later, because they had been living in these close, poorly ventilated quarters, a second family member would start showing the exact same symptoms.
And because they totally lacked the framework for microscopic bacteria lingering in shared air, they assumed a supernatural causality.
Right, they thought it was a curse.
Yeah, they genuinely believed that the first victim who died was rising from the grave in this spiritual form and slowly draining the life force from their surviving relatives.
The historical records of exhumations in New England are incredibly sobering. Like, the most famous case is Mercy Brown in Rhode Island in 1892.
Oh, I read about this.
Yeah, the family had lost multiple members to consumption, so when the brother fell ill, the community actually exhumed the bodies of his deceased mother and sisters.
Just dug them right up.
Dug them up. And because Mercy had died most recently during the winter, her body was relatively well preserved in the freezing ground.
Oh, boy.
They saw liquid blood in her heart, and they assumed she was the vampire feeding on her brother. So they burned her heart and they mixed the ashes in water for the sick brother to drink.
It is the ultimate manifestation of terror and powerlessness.
Truly.
But the stark contrast to this rural horror is what makes the history of tuberculosis so bizarre. Because it wasn't just terrorizing farmers in New England, it crossed every single class boundary.
It really did. In the 19th century, most infectious diseases, like typhus and cholera, they were inextricably linked to poverty, poor sanitation, and contaminated water.
Right, diseases of the slums.
Exactly. And tuberculosis certainly thrived in overcrowded, damp, urban tenements. The slums of London and New York were the great engines of the epidemic. But the pathogen didn't care about your bank account.
No, it didn't.
It moved upward into the aristocracy with terrifying ease.
It touched the absolute heights of society. I mean, factory workers died, sure, but so did John Keats, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Frederick Chopin, Anton Chekhov.
The Brontes?
Yes, the entire Bronte family. The list of cultural icons consumed by this disease is just staggering. And because it was killing the brilliant, the wealthy, and the beautiful, Victorian society couldn't just dismiss it as a disease of the poor.
No, they had to assimilate it somehow.
Exactly. They romanticized it.
And that romanticization was deeply tied to a very specific clinical phenomenon observed in the end stages of the disease. Physicians documented a state they called spes phthisica, which translates to the hope of the consumptive.
I was looking into the modern biochemical theories behind spes phthisica. It wasn't just some cultural invention, right? It was an actual physiological reaction.
Yeah. It was, absolutely. As the disease reached its final phase, patients experience severe hypoxia, which is a lack of oxygen to the brain, combined with a massive systemic inflammatory response.
Okay, so the body is just freaking out.
Exactly. The body is flooding with cytokines, specifically tumor necrosis factor alpha. Historically, that was called conchectin because it causes severe muscle wasting.
Right.
But these cytokines also interact directly with the central nervous system. So the combination of persistent low-grade fever, hypoxia, and neuroinflammation frequently triggered these episodes of intense delusional euphoria.
So they would experience these manic bursts of creative energy and mental clarity. They would make grand, ambitious plans for the future, completely convinced they were on the verge of a miraculous recovery, even as their lungs were literally liquefying.
Yeah, and the observers around them interpreted this chemically induced mania as the soul sharpening as the body faded. They viewed this terrible wasting death as something inherently beautiful and, spiritually elevating. Lord Byron perfectly captured this twisted cultural mindset. He reportedly looked in a mirror and said he would like to die of consumption because all the women would say how interesting he looked in dying.
That is such a fascinating sociological defense mechanism. Society basically took a horrific, unstoppable biological monster, put a velvet tuxedo on it, and invited it to dinner.
That's a great way to put it.
They couldn't fight it, so they dressed it up in lace and tragedy.
And that tuxedo was basically a coping mechanism for the total vacuum of medical efficacy. The mainstream medical response was a chaotic mess of contradictory advice.
Because nobody knew what was going on.
Right, because the prevailing miasma theory suggested diseases were caused by bad air, one doctor would prescribe bleeding the patient to balance their humors.
Always the bleeding.
Always. Then another would prescribe long, punishing sea voyages, and yet another would insist on mountain climates.
Yeah, and if a patient goes to 10 different esteemed physicians and receives 10 completely conflicting prescriptions, the inescapable conclusion is that literally nobody knows anything.
So the medical establishment eventually reached a critical realization. If they couldn't attack the pathogen directly, mainly because they didn't even know what it was until Koch's discovery, and they couldn't formulate a chemical cure, they had to manipulate the only variable left to them.
Which was the environment.
Exactly. They had to aggressively manage the host's metabolic demand and their environment.
The environment became the medicine. And that philosophical shift birthed the era of the medical monastery, which is the sanatorium.
Yeah, and the movement traces its origins back to a German physician named Hermann Bremer around 1854. Bremer claimed to have cured his own tuberculosis by traveling to the high altitudes of the Himalayas.
The physiological leak he made there is really interesting. He essentially concluded that there were immune zones on the planet.
What?
Like places where the barometric pressure, the cold, and the purity of the air offered a geographical cure that the smog-choked cities totally lacked.
Yeah, so he returned to Germany and opened a facility in the Silesian mountains called a Kurhaus, which means a healing place.
Okay.
His original protocol was actually incredibly active. He fed patients rich diets, supplemented with Hungarian wine and cognac.
Sounds pretty good so far.
Right, but then he forced them to take rigorous hikes and endure freezing waterfall douches under his supervision.
See, the mainstream medical journals, like The Lancet, mocked him relentlessly for that. And frankly, cold waterfall douches for a patient with compromised lungs sounds like a really fast track to pneumonia.
It does, and the establishment absolutely dismissed him as crude. But his reported outcomes could not be ignored.
Because it was working.
Well, by 1869, Bremer claimed a mortality rate of less than 5% among his patients.
Wow, 5%.
Yeah. Now, even accounting for selection bias, he was likely admitting patients who were wealthy enough to travel, and perhaps in much earlier stages of the disease, the survival rate was astronomically better than the trajectory of the urban poor.
So the concept caught fire, but the application evolved rapidly, right? Because the sanatorium directors realized that forcing a patient with decaying lungs to climb mountains was actually accelerating the caseous necrosis.
Exactly.
They dropped the exertion and pivoted entirely to its extreme opposite. Rest became the fundamental, absolutely uncompromising religion of tuberculosis treatment.
And the scale of the infrastructure built around this philosophy was just immense. In North America, Edward Livingston Trudeau opened the Adirondack Cottage Sanitarium in Saranac Lake in 1885.
Oh yeah, Saranac Lake is famous for that.
Very. And by the 1920s, cities with dry climates like Tucson, Arizona were totally overwhelmed, housing thousands of patients in these vast tent cities.
And the daily regimen inside these flagship facilities was, it was absolute authoritarian control over the human body. They operated under the belief that fresh air and total immobility would somehow coax the body to calcify those granulomas we talked about earlier.
Right.
So they designed massive brick buildings with long open-air terraces facing south just to catch the sun. And patients were wheeled out onto these terraces every single day, without exception.
And the temperature was completely irrelevant. Patients were wrapped in heavy wool blankets, lying on these specially designed cure chairs, which, fun fact, is actually where the modern Adirondack chair comes from.
Wait, really? The Adirondack chair comes from TB wards?
It does, yeah. So they'd be out there in sub-zero winter temperatures for up to 10 hours a day.
The psychological toll of that enforced immobility must have been staggering. The sources detail how they were forbidden from doing anything that required metabolic energy.
Nothing at all.
No reading, no talking to the patient next to them, no laughing. They believed that any exertion diverted energy away from the immune system's task of walling off the bacteria.
And within this framework of absolute control and metabolic micromanagement, a singular metric emerged as the ultimate proxy for survival, and that was weight gain.
Because it's a wasting disease.
Exactly. Tuberculosis fundamentally increases the body's basal metabolic rate while completely destroying the appetite. Patients arrived severely malnourished. Therefore, every doctor and nurse obsessed over the scale.
Yeah, I was looking at the admission and discharge records for some of these early facilities. Every pound gained was celebrated as a massive victory. Every pound lost was viewed as a step toward the grave.
Right.
But this raises a huge methodological red flag. If you take an impoverished factory worker out of a lightless, damp tenement where they were breathing coal smoke constantly,
Yeah.
and you place them in a pristine mountain facility, feed them 3 enormous, nutrient-dense meals a day, and prevent them from burning any calories through hard labor,
Hmm.
wouldn't their immune system naturally rally?
It is the defining conundrum of pre-antibiotic medicine. Many patients did rally. Their immune systems used the sudden surplus of calories and the lack of physical stress to successfully calcify the lung lesions. The disease would essentially go into remission.
So the freezing air on the terrace, the strict silence, all of that was essentially just medical theater wrapped around the core benefits of basic rest and nutrition.
Well, the tragedy of the era is that they had absolutely no statistical mechanisms to separate those variables. Modern medicine relies on randomized controlled trials to isolate the specific effect of an intervention.
Right, which they didn't have.
The sanatorium doctors didn't have that tool at all. They couldn't untangle the removal of environmental risk from the active treatment. If a patient survived, the doctor credited the entire package: the freezing air, the silence, the specific altitude, everything.
Because they couldn't attack the bacteria directly, they had to manipulate the body's metabolic math. They needed a nutritional cheat code.
That's a good way to put it.
Because if weight gain is the only defense against a pathogen that destroys the appetite, doctors are inevitably going to seek out the most calorie-dense, easily digestible substance available. The patient needs massive caloric intake with zero digestive friction.
And that specific biological desperation is the exact doorway through which Dr. J.R. Crew and the milk cure enter the historical narrative.
So let's establish Dr. Crew's credentials, because it is vital to understand that he wasn't operating out of some traveling medicine show.
No, not at all.
He was an esteemed physician affiliated with the Mayo Foundation in Rochester, Minnesota, which is the direct predecessor to the modern Mayo Clinic. He was a pillar of the medical establishment.
Very much so. And in January of 1929, Crew published a comprehensive paper in Certified Milk magazine. While most sanatoriums utilized rich milk as a sort of dietary supplement alongside heavy meals, Crew looked at the digestive strain of solid food and decided to completely radicalize the approach.
He just tossed the solid food entirely.
He stripped away the meats, the grains, the vegetables. He made milk the sole protagonist of the healing process.
And the protocol he outlines is a brutal feat of human endurance. He would admit a patient, confine them to absolute bed rest, and immediately halt all solid food intake. The patient was prescribed exclusively raw, unpasteurized, full-fat milk from grass-fed Guernsey cows.
And the volume is just...
The volume is the part that breaks my brain. They would begin at roughly 3 quarts a day and aggressively scale up until the patient was consuming between 5 and 10 quarts of milk every 24 hours.
And this wasn't consumed at their leisure either. It was administered in small, precise quantities every 30 minutes, round the clock.
I still don't understand how a human being doesn't get violently ill from that. 10 quarts of Guernsey milk is 2.5 gallons.
Yeah.
And Guernsey milk has an incredibly high butterfat content, usually around 4.5 to 5%. We're talking about forcing nearly a gallon of pure liquid fat and gallons of lactose through a compromised digestive system every single day. How did their stomachs not completely shut down?
Well, the gastrointestinal distress in the initial days of the treatment was severe, and Crew actually acknowledges this in his writings. He viewed the initial nausea and diarrhea not as a failure, but as a cleansing crisis.
Cleansing crisis.
Classic.
Yeah.
And the human gut microbiome is remarkably adaptable, honestly. Over a period of weeks, the enzymatic production in the stomach and small intestine would aggressively upregulate to handle that massive lactose and lipid load.
Wow. And to manage the sheer volume of fluid processing, Crew included 2 other mandates in the protocol: hot baths to induce profound sweating, ostensibly to flush out toxins through the skin and relieve the kidneys, and a daily enema to force bowel clearance.
Yeah, the physiological rationale of the era is really fascinating to dissect. Crew theorized that the massive influx of raw milk induced a state of heavy diuresis, which is increased urine production, which he believed acted as a systemic flush. Furthermore, he hypothesized that the heavy butterfat content wasn't merely caloric. He believed the raw lipids were biologically necessary to aggressively rebuild the cellular walls that the disease had broken down.
And his clinical claims were just boundless. He wasn't just claiming victory over tuberculosis. He reported that this exact same milk protocol cured heart disease, advanced kidney failure, chronic high blood pressure, and even severe obesity.
He really thought it was a panacea.
He meticulously documented the case of a young boy covered in intractable psoriasis who, after less than a month of the milk diet, emerged with completely clear skin.
Though the most confounding claim from a modern endocrinology perspective involves his treatment of diabetes. Milk contains roughly 5% lactose, which is milk sugar.
Right.
At 10 quarts a day, patients were ingesting massive quantities of sugar. Yet Crew asserted that after 8 weeks on this extreme lactose diet, his diabetic patients were entirely sugar-free in their urine tests.
When you read his 1929 paper, the tone is incredibly striking. There is no manic defensive posturing. He writes with the serene, unshakable confidence of a scientist who believes he has fully decoded the human body.
He really does.
He cites Sir William Osler, the most venerated physician of the age. He states plainly that his clinical results have been so uniformly excellent that they fundamentally altered his conception of disease pathology.
Because he was operating within a perfectly sealed, self-confirming cognitive framework. Because he lacked a control group, every single outcome validated his hypothesis.
Exactly.
If a malnourished tuberculosis patient lay in a clean bed for 3 months, consumed 8,000 calories of milk a day, and their immune system managed to calcify the lesions, Crew logged it as undeniable proof of the milk's specific curative power.
And if the patient succumbed to the disease.
The framework easily absorbed the failure. The patient was simply admitted too late in the disease progression. Or, crucially, the milk wasn't pure enough. Or the patient hadn't adhered with enough discipline to the 30-minute dosing schedule.
Blaming the patient.
Always. The treatment itself remained theoretically flawless. Only the biological material or the application could fail.
It is an impenetrable loop of logic. But while Dr. Crew is at the Mayo Foundation writing these elegant papers about the miraculous healing properties of raw dairy, a horrifying epidemiological disaster is unfolding in the general population. The medical establishment had a colossal blind spot.
They did. And it remains one of the most tragic ironies in the history of medicine. The blind spot was an entirely different species of bacteria, Mycobacterium bovis.
Ovine tuberculosis.
Precisely. Mycobacterium bovis is a close genetic relative to the human tuberculosis strain, but its primary host is cattle. When a cow contracts bovine TB, the infection frequently localizes in the udder.
Oh no.
Consequently, the animal sheds massive quantities of the live bacteria directly into its milk.
Which means the raw, unpasteurized milk being prescribed as the ultimate life-saving medicine was, in reality, a heavily contaminated biological weapon.
Yes. And the pathology of Mycobacterium bovis in humans is distinctly different from pulmonary TB, primarily because of the route of entry.
Right, because you're drinking it, not breathing it.
Exactly. When a human inhales human TB, it attacks the lungs. When a human ingests bovine TB through contaminated milk, it bypasses the respiratory system entirely.
This is non-pulmonary tuberculosis.
The ingested bacteria penetrates the mucosal lining of the gastrointestinal tract. From there, it infiltrates the lymphatic system, causing massive swelling and rupture of the lymph nodes in the neck. That's a condition historically known as scrofula.
Okay, I've heard of that.
And even more devastatingly, the bacteria frequently traveled through the bloodstream to the skeletal system, specifically attacking the vertebrae.
Pott's disease.
Yes.
The medical archives detailing Pott's disease are just brutal to read. The bacteria essentially eats the spongy bone of the spinal column, causing the vertebrae to collapse and wedge forward, resulting in severe structural deformities and paralysis. And the victims of this specific transmission route were overwhelmingly children.
The epidemiological data from the era is harrowing. In the 1920s, which is the exact decade Dr. Crew was elevating the raw milk cure to gospel status, Mycobacterium bovis from contaminated milk was killing over 1,000 children every single year in England and Wales alone.
Over 1,000 a year.
And thousands more were left permanently crippled or scarred by spinal and lymphatic destruction.
Think about the magnitude of that cognitive dissonance. The medical community is championing massive consumption of raw milk to cure the Great Plague of the era, while that exact same substance is actively killing thousands of children through a parallel strain of the disease. How did the establishment justify this? Why didn't they recognize that the medicine was the vector?
Well, the historical record shows that physicians like Crewe were insulated by their elite logistics. Crewe was meticulous about sourcing his milk from tightly controlled, frequently inspected, pasture-raised Guernsey herds.
Ah, so he had the good stuff.
Right. He effectively created a microenvironment of uncontaminated milk for his specific clinical trials.
But the broader culture of raw milk enthusiasm that he helped legitimize didn't have access to pristine, elite dairy farms. The general public was buying raw milk from urban dairies where cows were packed into unsanitary sheds, cross-infecting each other rapidly. They were playing Russian roulette with every glass.
And the realization of this widespread slaughter is what catalyzed one of the most vital public health interventions of the 20th century. Governments initiated aggressive, mandatory herd testing and culling programs.
Right.
Concurrently, the implementation of high-temperature, short-time pasteurization became standardized. That's where milk is heated to 72 degrees Celsius for 15 seconds to destroy the pathogens without boiling the liquid.
And the statistical impact of that intervention is staggering. In England and Wales, the mortality rate from bovine tuberculosis plummeted from over 1,000 childhood deaths a year in the 1920s to exactly 12 deaths by the year 1953.
The intervention was an unmitigated triumph of public health engineering. It stopped the vector dead in its tracks.
But removing the vector didn't cure the people already dying of pulmonary consumption. The sanatoriums were still full.
Right, because human TB was still a huge issue.
Exactly. The belief in the rest cure and the milk cure persisted because there was still no alternative. Breaking a self-sustaining loop of medical belief requires more than just identifying a contaminated supply chain. It requires an undeniable, paradigm-shattering shock to the system.
And that shock didn't arrive from a refined clinical theory. It came from the dirt.
The dirt.
Yeah, we have to pivot away from the pristine terraces of the sanatoriums and jump forward to October 19th, 1943.
Let's set the scene for the breakthrough. We are in a cramped, poorly ventilated basement laboratory at Rutgers University in New Jersey. Working alone at the bench is a 23-year-old PhD student named Albert Schatz.
Right.
He is operating under the direction of a soil microbiologist named Selman Waxman. And Waxman had dedicated his career to screening thousands of soil microorganisms, operating on the theory that the intense competition in soil environments must produce natural antibiotic compounds.
So Waxman directed the broad research program, but Schatz was the one executing the incredibly hazardous bench work.
The dangerous stuff.
Extremely dangerous. Schatz was down in that basement, isolating and culturing the most virulent, lethal strains of Mycobacterium tuberculosis available. It was work so dangerous that his senior colleagues explicitly refused to handle the samples.
Wow. And on that specific day in October, from a sample of heavily manured soil, Schatz isolated a strain of bacteria called Streptomyces griseus. From that bacteria, he extracted a compound that would change the trajectory of human history. He named it streptomycin.
And Schatz demonstrated in the Petri dish that streptomycin didn't just inhibit the tuberculosis bacteria, it actively killed it.
Which was huge.
To understand why this was revolutionary, we have to look at how streptomycin works on a molecular level. It doesn't attack the waxy cell wall that thwarted the human immune system.
Right, it bypasses the armor entirely.
Exactly. It acts as an internal saboteur. Streptomycin infiltrates the bacterial cell and binds specifically to the 30S ribosomal subunit. The ribosome is the bacteria's protein factory.
Okay.
By binding to it, streptomycin causes the bacteria to misread its own messenger RNA. So the bacteria starts assembling defective, toxic proteins, which rapidly leads to cellular death.
But killing bacteria in a glass dish is entirely different from curing a human being. The medical establishment had been burned by false cures before. To prove streptomycin worked, the scientific community had to invent a completely new way of evaluating evidence.
And this is where the history of medicine fundamentally pivots. Following Schatz's discovery, the British Medical Research Council, under the guidance of a brilliant statistician named Austin Bradford Hill, designed and executed a clinical trial in 1946.
This wasn't just any trial. Hill practically invented the modern randomized controlled trial.
He really did. He introduced rigorous mathematical objectivity. Hill took a group of tuberculosis patients and divided them using random number tables.
So no bias.
Exactly. This eliminated the subtle, unconscious bias of doctors who might assign healthier patients to the new drug just to make it look better. One group received the standard treatment of the era, which was strict sanatorium bed rest. the control group. The other group received stripped bed rest combined with regular injections of streptomycin.
By randomizing the patients and holding the environment constant, they finally isolated the variable. They could see exactly what the drug was doing, completely divorced from the effects of rest and rich food.
And the results collapsed a century of medical dogma. While the bacteria did mutate and show resistance, which eventually required modern combination antibiotic therapy, the initial efficacy of streptomycin was undeniable. The drug hunted down and destroyed the pathogen inside the human body.
The epidemiological curve following this trial is literally a cliff face. Between 1930 and 1954, the mortality rate from tuberculosis in the United States plummeted from roughly 70 deaths per 100,000 people down to just 10 per 100,000.
The sanatorium empire vanished almost overnight.
Poof, gone.
Yeah, those massive architectural complexes in Saranac Lake in Tucson, the ones designed to freeze the disease out of patients over months and years, suddenly had no purpose. You didn't need to control the environment if you could chemically destroy the invader in a matter of weeks. The buildings emptied out, eventually repurposed as prisons, apartments, or just left to ruin.
The triumph of streptomycin is an incredible moment, but the human element behind its discovery remains deeply flawed. Albert Schatz, the PhD student who literally risked his life in that basement to isolate the compound, was systematically erased from the official narrative.
The historical record on this is clear and sobering. His supervisor, Selman Waxman, aggressively moved to claim sole credit for the discovery. Waxman minimized Schatz's role, secured lucrative patent deals, and in 1952 was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine entirely for the discovery of streptomycin.
That's awful. Schatz had to initiate a massive career-damaging lawsuit just to secure legal recognition as the co-discoverer and a fraction of the patent royalties. He was ostracized by the scientific community for daring to sue his mentor. It's a bitter footnote that proves the scientific method is perfect, but the humans executing it are deeply, deeply fallible.
And that human fallibility is exactly what makes the next phase of our story so critical. Because, as you noted earlier, the milk cure was never scientifically debunked.
Right.
Austin Bradford Hill didn't run a randomized controlled trial testing 2 gallons of raw milk against a placebo.
Because they didn't need to. If your house is engulfed in flames and for decades you've been trying to save it by throwing buckets of sand at the windows and someone suddenly invents the high-pressure fire hose, you don't commission the study to prove the sand is inefficient. You just hook up the hose.
Exactly. The milk cure wasn't disproven. It was rendered entirely obsolete by overwhelming efficacy. With the advent of targeted antibiotics, the debate over whether raw milk marginally improved the immune system's capacity to calcify granulomas became a moot point.
Nobody cared anymore.
The biological paradigm shifted, and the extreme dietary protocols of the 1920s were quietly archived in the dusty basements of medical libraries.
But ideas, especially ideas rooted in the appeal to nature and the simplicity of diet, rarely stay dead. They hibernate. They wait for the cultural climate to shift back in their favor. And to understand the resurrection of the milk cure, we have to bridge the gap between the antibiotic revolution of the 1950s and the dawn of the 21st century.
Because the decades following the discovery of streptomycin saw the massive industrialization of the global food supply, the rise of ultra-processed foods, the heavy use of synthetic pesticides, and the implementation of concentrated animal feeding operations fundamentally altered the human diet.
And by the 1970s and 80s, you see the massive rise of the wellness counterculture. People began noticing undeniable systemic health issues correlated with this heavily refined industrial diet. Rates of chronic metabolic diseases spiked. A profound, entirely justified distrust of the industrial agricultural complex began to take root.
And that specific cultural distrust created fertile ground for looking backward to find solutions. The figurehead they eventually latched onto was a man named Weston A. Price.
Price is a fascinating figure because he wasn't a fringe radical in his time. He was an incredibly observant dentist practicing in the 1920s and 30s. He grew alarmed by the rapid physical degeneration, specifically the severe dental decay and crowded dental arches he was seeing in his modern patients.
So Price executed an ambitious global research project. He traveled to extremely isolated populations that had not yet been integrated into the global trade network. He studied the Gaelic communities in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, the inhabitants of the isolated Lutschental Valley in the Swiss Alps, indigenous communities in North America, and Pacific Islanders.
And he brought a camera with him, and his photographic evidence is honestly compelling. He documented older generations in these isolated communities who possessed broad palates and perfectly straight, cavity-free teeth, despite having zero access to modern dentistry.
Right.
He then photographed their children who had been introduced to imported white flour, refined sugar, and canned goods. The physical deterioration in a single generation was undeniable. Rampant tooth decay, narrowed palates, and compromised bone structure.
In 1939, he published these findings in a seminal book titled Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. His core critique of refined carbohydrates and sugar was accurate and tragically prophetic.
Very prophetic.
However, his specific conclusions about what made the traditional diet so protective centered heavily on fat-soluble vitamins found in animal products, specifically organ meats, and heavily featured raw, unpasteurized dairy.
He theorized the existence of a specific nutrient he called activator X, which modern biochemists eventually identified as vitamin K2.
Yes.
He believed it was critical for mineral utilization and bone health and was heavily present in the butterfat of cows grazing on rapidly growing green grass.
Fast forward to the year 1999. The Weston A. Price Foundation is established. The foundation's primary mission is to aggressively advocate for the return to nutrient-dense traditional diets, leaning heavily on Price's original research regarding raw animal fats and unpasteurized dairy.
This foundation builds an ideological framework that positions industrial food processing not just as a mistake, but as an active adversary to human health. And it's within this aggressive search for historical validation that a naturopathic physician associated with the foundation, Ron Schmid, starts digging through the old medical archives.
He is looking for precedent. And in the archives, he unearths Dr. J.R. Crew's 1929 article in Certified Milk magazine.
It is the ultimate confirmation of their entire worldview. They find a respected Mayo Foundation doctor claiming that the exact substance they are advocating for, raw, full-fat milk, cured the most devastating diseases of the 20th century.
But the foundation doesn't just present Crew's historical findings as an interesting footnote. They fundamentally recontextualize the history to fit a modern conspiracy narrative.
Right.
They seize on Crew's lament that his method was too simple to interest a medical establishment focused on complex interventions.
But Crew meant that as a philosophical complaint about human nature. He thought doctors were just too proud to use a simple tool.
The modern advocates weaponize that complaint. They argue that Crew's deceptively simple, highly effective method wasn't just ignored by busy doctors. They claim it was actively, deliberately suppressed by an emerging pharmaceutical industrial complex.
The narrative they construct is incredibly potent, especially to a modern audience already wary of big pharma. They argue that the medical industry buried the milk cure because you cannot patent a cow. Raw milk is cheap, natural, and cannot generate the massive profit margins of synthesized drugs.
And to sustain this narrative, the modern advocates must engage in a terrifying degree of historical and biochemical erasure. Their central argument hinges on the claim that pasteurization is what destroyed the cure.
Here we go.
They argue that the heat from pasteurization destroys the living enzymes, denatures the fragile proteins, and kills the beneficial lactobacilli, transforming a miraculous living medicine into a dead allogenic fluid.
Let's dissect the actual chemistry of pasteurization here. Does heating the milk to 72 degrees Celsius actually destroy its nutritional capacity to the extent they claim?
The biochemistry does not support their narrative at all. Pasteurization does deactivate certain enzymes, most notably alkaline phosphatase, which is actually the specific marker dairy scientists test for to ensure the pasteurization process was successful.
Oh, interesting.
However, humans do not rely on bovine enzymes to digest milk. The human pancreas and brush border enzymes in the small intestine are perfectly capable of breaking down lactose and milk proteins.
So the idea that the heat kills the nutritional value is fundamentally flawed.
Completely. It denatures a minor fraction of the whey proteins, but the macronutrient profile, the fats, the carbohydrates, the sheer caloric density that Dr. Crew relied on to force weight gain in starving patients remains entirely intact.
Which means the foundation's logic requires a massive rewriting of reality. To believe that pasteurization robbed humanity of a cure for tuberculosis, you have to pretend that the entire history of microbiology didn't happen.
You have to completely erase Albert Schatz in that basement. You have to erase the molecular mechanism of streptomycin binding to the ribosome. You have to erase Austin Bradford Hill and the invention of the randomized controlled trial.
You have to look at an 85% drop in the tuberculosis death rate directly following the introduction of antibiotics and attribute it to
What?
coincidence.
Right.
And far more dangerously, you have to completely erase the existence of Mycobacterium bovis.
Yeah.
You have to look past the graves of thousands of children whose spines were eaten away by the very raw milk this foundation is promoting as a suppressed miracle.
Because by anchoring their entire philosophy to a 1929 Trade magazine article, they freeze time. They elevate uncontrolled, unsystematic clinical observations from the pre-antibiotic era to the level of undeniable gospel.
Yeah.
And they use it to insist that the modern medical consensus is built on a foundation of lies.
It is a rhetorical masterpiece. Because if you try to point out the microbiological reality of bovine TB, or the statistical triumph of antibiotics, the advocates simply accuse you of defending a corrupt corporate food system and attacking individual health freedom. They conflate two entirely separate issues.
There is a massive distinction to be made here. The medical and agricultural establishments have documented histories of profound failure, regulatory capture, and devastating blind spots.
Totally.
The overprescription of antibiotics, the environmental degradation caused by industrial farming, the metabolic crisis triggered by ultra-processed foods, these are critical systemic failures that demand rigorous skepticism.
Questioning why bread in the supermarket has 30 chemical ingredients is entirely valid. Weston A. Price was undeniably correct to sound the alarm on the physical toll of a refined diet.
He was.
But the modern movement takes a legitimate, necessary grievance about food processing and uses it as a Trojan horse to smuggle in the total rejection of germ theory. They use a kernel of dietary truth to justify abandoning scientific methodology entirely.
Which brings us to the core philosophical lesson of this whole discussion. The narrative of the milk cure forces us to examine the anatomy of our own skepticism. We must differentiate between healthy institutional critique and the dangerous descent into dogmatic, unfalsifiable belief.
The line between being a critical thinker and a conspiracy theorist feels blurrier now than ever. How do we define that boundary?
Well, scientific skepticism is an active, demanding process. It requires you to ask a very specific, inherently uncomfortable question of your own beliefs. And that is, what specific evidence would have to be presented to me to prove that my theory is wrong? A legitimate skeptic actively hunts for the flaws in their own logic.
They design the randomized controlled trial specifically to prove themselves wrong and only accept the theory if it survives the fire.
Exactly. But the modern resurrection of the raw milk cure abandons that process. They have simply replaced the flawed authority of the medical establishment with a different, far more rigid authority, the romantic allure of ancient tradition backed by internet testimonials. If 100 people on a forum claim that drinking unpasteurized milk cured their asthma or their autoimmune disorder, that anecdotal consensus is treated as unimpeachable, peer-reviewed data.
It becomes an unfalsifiable loop of faith, masquerading as independent research. If a person drinks the raw milk and their condition doesn't improve, the theory itself is never questioned.
No.
The community simply decides the execution was flawed. The cow wasn't 100% grass-fed. The patient didn't drink a high enough volume. The patient's liver was too toxic from years of consuming seed oils. The cure is structurally designed so that it can never fail. Only the believer can fail the cure.
And that logical structure, the impenetrable self-confirming loop, is the exact same cognitive trap that Dr. Crew and the sanatorium directors were trapped in a century ago.
History repeating itself.
Exactly. The modern advocates haven't evolved past the pre-antibiotic era. They have actively, intentionally retreated back into its methodology.
Which brings my mind right back to where we started this entire conversation. That desperate soldier in the 1920s tuberculosis ward, hiding his stash of raw milk while his lungs slowly failed him.
Yeah, when you evaluate his actions through the lens of the microbiology, the history, and the psychology we've just discussed, what is your primary takeaway?
Honestly, just profound empathy. His impulse to take absolute control of his own biology is universally human. When the official sanctioned medical system looks you in the eye and essentially says, "We don't know how to stop this, just lie perfectly still in the freezing air and hope your body figures it out."
Yeah.
It is deeply rational to seek out a secret backdoor to survival. He wasn't stupid. He was terrified, and he was grasping at the only tangible action available to him.
The human drive for agency, especially in the face of inevitable mortality, overrides almost all other cognitive functions.
But that is the ultimate tragedy of the milk cure. When the stakes are literal life and death, desperation completely neutralizes our capacity for honest evaluation. We want the simple magic trick to be real so badly that we lose the ability to notice when it is failing us.
We really do.
A patient drinks the milk, gains 2 pounds of fat, notices a slight decrease in their cough for a few days, and they cling to that minor fluctuation as undeniable proof of the miracle, intentionally ignoring the larger, darker reality of the pathogen still consuming them from the inside.
The actual clinical outcome becomes secondary. The primary function of the treatment is to provide the psychological comfort of possessing a cure to believe in.
So let's tie these threads together. We have tracked an incredible century-long arc today. We started in the absolute terror of a world hunted by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, examining how society romanticized the horror it couldn't control. We look at the rise of the sanatoriums, where doctors attempted to freeze and starve the disease into submission. We break down Dr. Crew's radical protocol, turning 2 gallons of milk a day into an impenetrable medical gospel.
The 10 quarts a day.
Yeah, the 10 quarts. We uncover the horrifying irony of bovine TB, the fact that the presumed cure was frequently the vector of an equally devastating disease. We explored the genuine scientific triumph of Albert Schatz's streptomycin and the randomized controlled trials that brought the light of methodology into the darkness.
The fire hose.
The fire hose. And finally, we watched as the modern wellness movement resurrected a dead 1920s theory, weaponizing our modern distrust of industrial systems to build a dangerous, unfalsifiable mythology.
It is a sweeping narrative that reveals as much about human psychology as it does about biology. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, somewhat uncomfortable thought to consider regarding the flow of information. Think about how the digital age has permanently altered the life cycle of a medical theory.
How does the internet change the fundamental nature of these ideas?
Historically, when an idea was proven biologically incorrect or made obsolete by superior science, it effectively died. It was archived in a dusty medical journal in a university basement, forgotten by the public, and the world moved forward.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. But in our current digital ecosystem, nothing ever truly dies. It is perfectly preserved in the digital amber, simply waiting. It waits for a shift in the cultural mood. It waits for a new algorithm, a new wellness influencer desperate for contrarian content, a new era of institutional distrust to reanimate it.
Wow.
The zombie theories of the past are always out there, fully accessible, which raises a critical question for all of us. What outdated, disproven, desperate idea from the past are we, right now, actively participating in without even realizing it? What is our era's version of the milk cure?
That is a fascinating, truly necessary question to ask ourselves every single time we scroll through our feeds and encounter a simple solution to a complex problem. Thank you all so much for joining us for this narrative feature. Keep questioning the narrative, keep demanding rigorous evidence, and most importantly, stay curious. Until next time.